Dr. Brian Gillett needs very little introduction on our Downstate stage. Brian trained here. This is where his professional roots lay and grew until his departure to Boulder, Colorado in 2015. At UHB, KCHC, and Maimonides, our faculty and trainees alike kind of mourned his departure, but continue to dearly appreciate the legacy of excellence that he fostered, not only within his department, but for the hospital-wide clinical skills and quality improvement. A little background on Dr. Gillett, if I may. Brian is a graduate of Oberlin College, where he earned his Bachelor of Science and then his medical degree from McGill University. I initially met Brian during his internship at Jacobi Medical Center, where he graduated from emergency medicine residency. Brian's first position was here at Downstate. A short year after he joined our staff, he became the founder and director of the Center for Advanced Learning, a division of the Department of Emergency Medicine, providing both medical education and quality improvement tools and strategies. In 2007, Brian founded and became CEO of a company called Evaluation Technologies. This company provides cloud-based software solutions for assessing and tracking clinical competencies of undergraduate and graduate healthcare students and trainees. This innovative organization ultimately provided software solutions to New York Department of Health. This was for deploying citywide emergency preparedness drills and for tracking the state of emergency preparedness across New York City. Before his departure from Downstate, Brian was promoted to medical director of the ALRC, or the Advanced Learning Resource Center, for all of our colleges campus-wide. In 2010, Brian joined the faculty of our fortunate Brooklyn friends and affiliate, Maimonides Medical Center. At Maimonides, he founded and directed the Center for Clinical Simulation using grant funding from the hospital's malpractice insurance provider. This state-of-the-art center trains healthcare providers across a wide range of experience and disciplines to improve patient safety, promote professional excellence, teamwork, and clinical error reduction. Finally, in 2013, Brian founded and became CEO of SimCore Technologies, a company that provided cloud-based software solutions for clinical simulation training and quality improvement. SimCore Technologies was ultimately merged with two other advanced simulation companies to form Health Scholars, Inc., an enterprise software corporation delivering advanced healthcare education and quality improvement solutions in Boulder, Colorado. Brian, now living in Boulder, Colorado, continues on today as President and Chief Medical Officer of Healthcare Scholars, Inc., all the while continuing to practice emergency medicine and winning all kinds of resident and student teaching awards as he goes. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Brian Gillett.
Thank you. That's quite the introduction. Thank you very much. So it is just a real honor to be back virtually. And I just wanted to start with a brief anecdote. Downstate and Kings County were my very first faculty positions after finishing residency. And I had the fortune of spending one of my first shifts in our trauma area on West Indian Day Parade. And I'm not sure what it's like now, but in 2003, that was a very wild time. Realized that I had a lot to learn about being an attending. A few days after that shift, I'll never forget, Dr. Lucchese had come up and put his arm around my shoulder and said, "So Brian, what's your thing gonna be?" And inside I was thinking, probably just learning how to be an attending after that shift. After a pregnant pause, he related, well, there's this simulator thing in a closet that one of the graduating residents had acquired. Why don't you go see if you can do something with that? And I very quickly drank the Kool-Aid and became enamored with simulation as a modality for improving medical performance, clinical performance, and decreasing errors. So these two pictures here are one of the very early days of the simulation facility at Kings County Hospital, and then the Advanced Learning Resource Center, which was in the basement of the library at Downstate before I had left. So let me, before we get into virtual reality, which I'm really excited to speak to, I'd like to just spend a couple slides discussing digital education. So we now hear digital everywhere, digital transformation, digital health, digital education. So what actually is digital education? There's a number of definitions that relate to technology integration in some shape with regard to imparting learning. But the definition that's most resonant to me is actually from Digital Learning Now. That's a national organization that led an initiative to transform K through 12 education into the digital era. And they define it as learning that's facilitated by technology to give students control over time, place, path, and/or pace. And I think that's super salient and pertinent to clinical education, where we really need to focus on enabling our learners, whether it's undergraduate, graduate medical education, or professionals and allied health members, the ability to develop mastery before moving on to the next topic. So there are a number of trends that are driving this transformative process from the classroom into the digital era. Namely, there's a few that I think are particularly salient. Over the last decade, there has been an explosion of digital technologies, including e-learning and a number of interactive internet capabilities. Also, big data from integrated systems are now able to provide an awareness of where you are as a learner and actually provide some adaptive capabilities and personalized learning, and also enable rich analytics to help identify gaps and to then target those gaps. Probably the most challenging for all of us, and especially those of us in education, is just a challenging fiscal climate. It's been challenging for some time, more so after the pandemic. And I think that the new normal for the foreseeable future is going to require us educators to continue providing more with less. We're going to have to continue to provide out meaningful resources with meaningful trainings with fewer human resources. So there is a need for transformative change. And I think the three important elements in this transformation involve learning the learner. So technologies should be able to give the learner what they need when they need it, and to enable active learning at scale. So I'm a big simulation enthusiast, but it's very difficult to scale experience-based training. That's an active form of learning that we know has significant benefits over the passive, screen-based or PowerPoint types of presentations. And then most importantly, and relevant to clinical education, is providing opportunities for deliberate practice on on-demand clinical experiences. So there may be a low occurrence, high stakes clinical encounter that we just haven't seen in a number of months or possibly years in the pediatric paradigm. And we need to be able to spin up these types of experiences so that we can all step into a real-to-life patient encounter, make the mistakes in a zero-fault environment, and be ready to be our best on the worst day of someone's life. These shifts in education, I think, largely fall out across three domains: time, place, and pace. And so what we're seeing is a departure from restricted single session types of learning to on-demand learning that can be repeated as often as necessary to develop mastery. The education now should be brought out to the learner as much as possible, rather than constraining learning opportunities to a brick and mortar setting. And then lastly, and possibly most importantly, is a shift away from a sort of rote teaching approach where we group learners by experience levels and then teach to the middle, but rather provide out opportunities for learners to spend as much time or as little time as needed to develop mastery, and then enable them to move on to the next topic. So this is why I'm so passionate about VR. I'm a simulation enthusiast, and I really see simulation as a powerful ally towards improving clinical performance and error reduction. And VR, which I'll speak a great deal about in this presentation, enables all of the benefits that we've seen with regard to improving clinical performance from simulation to large learner populations. This next slide is one that probably most of us are all familiar with. Before COVID, medical errors have been the third leading cause of death in our country. And now after the vaccine, it's back up to the third leading cause. It's very costly. And there's a significant amount of hospital operational budgets that are devoted to education with very little understanding of the return on that education and that investment. And I see simulation as a really important arrow in the quiver of patient safety and improvements in clinical performance and efforts to minimize clinical errors. So what is it? There's really three things that we think of when we're speaking of XR. XR is anything that is a type of non-real reality. So augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. I just want to briefly, sorry. Are you still seeing my screen? My screen just went black. It's back. I just want to briefly, great, thank you, speak to these three different modalities and just what they are. So augmented reality superimposes digital content on top of your real world environment. And this could be with like a smartphone. Snapchat is a great example of that, where you can see yourself with a mustache or cat ears. There was an old game called Pokemon Go that would superimpose these little Pokemon creatures on the street or on the sidewalk. Virtual reality completely removes you from your world and teleports you into a new world where you are fully immersed into a virtual world. And this is going to be the focus of our talk today. I do just want to speak to mixed reality because this is a super exciting and emerging technology. Mixed reality is a hybrid of both of augmented reality and virtual reality. Here, we are superimposing digital content into the real world, but the difference here is that physical and digital objects can recognize one another. So in mixed reality, I could hold a virtual ball in my hand and interact with it and actually see it moving back and forth in my hand. There's some really interesting technologies here with regard to clinical education where we can peel back the layers of a cadaver for learning anatomy, There's even applications where we can superimpose a 16-year-old child or a 75-year-old adult on a low fidelity torso to do chest compressions. So that's a really exciting modality that is rapidly evolving. So why is all this important? Well, what's going on that's sort of potently driving this transformative change to digital? In my world view, I really am focused on delivering experiences to large learner populations. And 2 decades ago, before healthcare consolidation, we would have maybe one hospital and a small cadre of learners. But fast forward 2 decades, we're seeing a ton of healthcare consolidation of the educational providers, and having to do more with less. So the average hospital system has 14 hospitals, about 200 outpatient locations. We might have 9,000 nurses, 1,500 physicians, a total of 25,000 employees, and a very skeleton education team. So how do we provide meaningful experiential training at any meaningful cadence at scale? And that's really where virtual reality solves the problem. So here, I want to just speak a little bit about the evolution of training. We started with classroom style training. This was really powerful, really good with small learner groups. You could attend to a small learner group and provide some personalized education. But as that learner group grows, we very quickly lose that ability to provide this type of personalized education. As the learner size increased, and the advent of the internet, we moved to e-learning. So e-learning solved the problem of scale, but it became very difficult to teach very complex topics. And it certainly is not great for providing experiential training, reference experiences. We went back and backwards a bit, understanding that there was a real need for experiential training, and developed mannequin-based simulation, which was outstanding. And we have now 2 decades of data and evidence that shows that this type of experiential training really moves the needle. It provided for training on complex cognitive processes, provided experiences, but the challenge here is that it just doesn't scale. And so VR really combines the benefits of mannequin-based simulation on clinical performance and the scalability of e-learning. And that's why it's such a powerful arrow in the quivers of all the educational modalities available to us, and particularly why it plays a major role in the digital education transformation. VR is really a sort of a process automation tool, if you think about it in many ways. It takes this analog simulation, mannequin-based simulation paradigm and puts it in software. And so for administrators, that results in decreased resource needs, less resource consumption, significantly less scheduling burden. It's massively less expensive. And when connected to a backend system, we can actually track outcomes. So after, say, an obstetric hemorrhage simulation in VR, did we decrease the numbers of blood units that were dispersed from the blood bank? Did the length of stay decrease with patients who had the ICD-10 diagnosis of obstetric hemorrhage? For learners, we decreased their time requirement. So a standard simulation usually runs about an hour, and most VR simulations will last under 30 minutes. We also provide the ability to repeat at a meaningful frequency. So again, with that obstetric hemorrhage example, it's hard to get learners into a brick and mortar simulation center at less than once a year, and we know that skills decay far more quickly than that. So we're able to provide VR, but with these goggles here, provides the just in time, just in place, and kind of any time as often as needed types of training. And that's what really excites me about this. Also, the evaluations now can be objective, that you're being evaluated against a set of objective criteria by a computer. Okay, so what actually does it mean to virtualize? And this slide is showing the virtualization of a simulation that we run in the perioperative department to train on surgical fires. This training is required for all new perioperative nursing, and at many organizations is required at least once or twice a year to maintain compliance with JCAP. By moving this into software, we're now able to provide this truly immersive experience without all of the resource required to stand up this type of training. When we used to run this in the Sim Center at Downstate, back when I was there, we would need 6 people to run this scenario. And another really interesting anecdote I just want to throw out is I bumped into this educator from Russell Phillips Association. That's the organization that does the lion's share of fire training for healthcare in our country. And this guy would literally go around to the perioperative units, put a Kevlar plate over his crotch and light it on fire. And then let the perioperative team extinguish the fire according to protocol. Now, while kind of exciting the first time you're doing this, I'll just suffice it to say he was extremely excited to hear that there's an alternative to lighting his crotch on fire multiple times a day. Okay, and now on this fire paradigm, I want to share some experience at Cedars-Sinai with this particular training. They looked at the return on investment by virtualizing that surgical fire training into VR compared to their standard modality, which is to run this in a simulation session in center. And this was from spring of 2019. They found that to run a session, they would invest 2.2 hours in just learner resource, let alone all the administrative resource required to actually run a simulation. So nurses had to scrub out, had to commute, spent an hour in a sim lab, had to commute back, scrub back in. And when they virtualized this, they just allocated 30-minute slots and left a VR headset in the perioperative areas so that during downtime or slack time, the participants could just step out, put the goggles on. They spent about 18 minutes in the apps to do their surgical training, and then ultimately ended up performing 250% better when they measured long-term skills retention. And in this particular study, Cedars-Sinai found that they saved $100,000 after getting through their whole perioperative staff, once through the training. So really, virtualizing changes how these business processes are executed. And by moving from analog to digital, we can see significant economic advantages, let alone the learning gains that I just related. I'm going to shift just a bit to another use case that is particularly interesting and another excellent example of VR. And I will have some videos to show. It's hard to present VR without actually stepping into the headset. You really get an aha moment when you put the headset on and you realize that you might as well be standing on Mars or another planet because you're completely in a different environment. So in this picture, this is one of ours. This is Chris Ingwelson, one of my colleagues at Health Scholars, and we did some green screen shoots to try to provide out like what this really feels like in VR. So she is fully immersed in this radiology suite. And yes, this is actually modeled after the Kings County Radiology Suite, because that's where I got my start in simulation, and feels completely part of this virtual team and this patient. So in this particular simulation, she's actually speaking to the team. She's having to use team member names and good communication strategies, closed loop communication. At the end of this particular virtual reality simulation, there's a debrief. And so much like debriefs are very important to experience-based learning. It's when we are most primed to take in information after just participating in a real life experience. So we also can move the debrief into virtual reality. We've just cared for a really difficult patient encounter, and now we're ready to learn, and we can be presented by an avatar areas of improvement, areas that we did well, so that we can then close those gaps with a subsequent run through. Let me show you just a little bit of what this looks like. So just again, she feels completely immersed in this environment, and this is what she's saying.
Mr. Nelson is a 56-year-old man who's here for a PICC line. As we were getting set up, he developed this rhythm. We hooked him up to the biphasic defibrillator and have the airway equipment ready, just in case. He has a pulse. What should we do?
All right, Aaron, let's give him 6 milligrams of adenosine.
Giving adenosine 6 milligrams.
Whoa.
All right, sir, how are you feeling?
All right, the adenosine is in.
Sir, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine.
All right, Aaron, let's push another 12 milligrams of adenosine, please.
Giving adenosine 12 milligrams.
Oh, yeah, there it goes.
So I'll pause here.
He's not breathing.
So here, we are really immersed in this patient encounter. And in this particular example, the technology is using natural language processing. So one is able to not only just speak to avatars, but we can actually track how well are we communicating. Are we using closed loop communications? Are we specifying dosing? Are we using team member names? And
Mr. Nelson is a 56-year-old man who...
And all of those types of metrics now with big data are measurable and can be integrated back in to identify gaps so that one can then just go provide more targeted training, adaptive learning, rather than just shotgun approach and repeat the whole thing. I just want to show this use case also. This is outside of the hospital environment. Here's an example of an ACLS application for pre-hospital learning. And I'm going to move along to when he develops cardiac arrest. Okay, so this is a learner, EMS learner, who is practicing ACLS in an in-home environment.
It's been 2 minutes.
Andre, swap compressors and check his pulse.
Checking for a pulse.
You can see that the patient's skin color even changed. He just looks a lot less
Maria,
alive.
start chest compressions. Aaron, give epinephrine. Sonia, defibrillate.
Starting compressions.
Charging. All clear.
Shock delivered.
Giving 1 milligram of epinephrine IV push and will repeat every 3 to 5 minutes. Is line infiltrated? I know this patient well. We're going to have a hard time finding another vein. What should we do?
Aaron, let's drill intraosseous.
Placing a left tibial interosseous.
Andre, let's check his pulse.
It hasn't been 2 minutes yet. We should continue compressions for 2 minutes before switching compressors and checking.
So now here, the application is going to send to the back end that this learner tried to check a pulse before 2 minutes have transpired. And when resuscitating a patient, that's just not a good thing. We want to maximize compression times. So these types of subtleties can get identified to a much greater extent and with more accuracy when being evaluated by a computer system with artificial intelligence than by humans. And now we're able to sort of generate readiness reports and to drill down on those competency areas that really need particular focus rather than just repeating the entire learning experience rotely.
You'll be working with.
So why am I showing ACLS VR? Because this is a great example of how virtual reality is solving the problem of skills decay, and by providing an anytime, anywhere frequency needed to maintain skills and maintain proficiency for resuscitation. I just, I don't want us to read this whole slide. I just wanted to show this article in circulation from just a few years ago. There's been a number of studies that have looked at the impact of improved resuscitation training on survival to discharge for patients with cardiac arrest. And in summary, the author in circulation, just summarizing a lot of these statements, relates that given the 500,000 cardiac arrests per year, enhanced training and knowledge translation could save more lives than any scientific breakthrough that we've studied to date. And that's really, really freaking powerful. I'm going to show just a few interesting studies here. There was a great study in JAMA a few years ago that looked at the heterogeneity across health systems and across hospitals with regard to the rate of survival to discharge after an in-hospital cardiac arrest. And these authors found three things really correlated, whether or not they were tracking the quality of compressions, if there was a good, a debrief, what did we do well, what went wrong after every code, and then the most important factor in this meta-analysis was training. And here, facilities where the staff self-reported optimal training were at the upper quintile of survival rates to hospital discharge. So rates varied between 9% to 38%, and that's still about where they live right now. And if you were if your facilities had a number of staff self-reporting optimal training, you are more likely to be at that 38% number than those who did not, and with like a 9% discharge. That's actually really powerful to me. Another one that I wanted to highlight, I just summarized a few articles, and I'd be happy to send these out after the talk once I'm sure Dr. Jacobson-Dickman or Mr. Worthy will get me emails and I can provide these links out. This is just summarizing, okay, great, thank you. A few different studies that are salient. And these studies all looked at the impact of resuscitative training on survival to discharge after in-hospital cardiac arrest. And we're seeing variability here. So like at the bottom end, you might have 28%, higher end, 53%. This study really varied. There was 69% versus 28%. Taken together, on average, these are the kind of the primary studies, optimal training can increase survival to discharge after in-hospital cardiac arrest by almost 30%. And that's really huge. So when we talk about medical errors, it really means these are people's lives on the hook here. And just before in the moments before one arrests, those were the last moments that person had on this planet, and the last moments that they'll be with their family. So if there is something that we can do as a clinical community and as clinical educators to improve the likelihood of bringing someone back if it wasn't their time, we really should be doing that. Now, in terms of optimal training, what is optimal training? It seems to boil down with resuscitation to frequency. So this is another study that was in circulation a few years ago that looked at outpatient cardiac arrest. And here, this had a very large N. There was about 48,000 patients in this longitudinal study. And the authors concluded that it's the frequency, it's the amount of time that transpired before your last cardiac arrest call. And here they found that if more than 3 months have transpired since your last touch point with a cardiac arrest scenario, there was a material decrease in survival rates. The odds ratio for survival was markedly lower. And that is super, super powerful. And it's why the American Heart Association now has shifted to a continuous learning model for resuscitation skills. The days of certifying once and then not touching ACLS again for 2 years are over. And it's just absurd. There's a number of studies that show that only about 30% of participants will be proficient with ACLS skills after 90 days. And that's completely aligns to the findings of, that this study of this particular study in circulation all the way back from 2016. So frequency, repeatability, deliberate practice, which means step into an encounter, make mistakes, deliberately learn from those mistakes, and step back in and improve. And we just can't do that with our traditional tools. But with a digital transformation, and particularly with virtual reality, we can. It makes that practical impossibility possible. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this stuff. So this is not about credentials, it's about quality. So shifting to this spaced, deliberate practice model really makes a difference. And the resource constraints that we're up against today, the physical constraints of non-digital learning in a brick and mortar setting, really make it just a practical impossibility to provide out the deliberate practice at the meaningful cadence needed to move the needle. With virtual reality, by virtualizing those processes, we certainly can. I want to relate this briefly. So Mount Sinai did a study to compare the benefits or just to compare the value of training with ACLS in virtual reality against the traditional high fidelity model. And they found like some interesting findings. So the trainings were equally efficacious. They both imparted the same improvement in performance, and yet the virtual reality had like an 83% cost efficiency as compared to the high fidelity simulation. Also, it took the learners about half the time. And something that we don't think about often enough is how taxing these trainings can be on instructors. So the instructor burden to run, I think they had was like 20 to 30 residents, I think, in that study through high fidelity simulation once was pretty significant. And it was actually 5 times more taxing than with VR. And in VR, they still actually had someone facilitating the sessions because it was a relatively new technology to them at the time. Today, we're seeing a significant number of education programs, residencies that are integrating in nursing schools who have really adopted VR to a great extent, are integrating virtual reality into an instructor-less model. So there's really like zero instructor burden here. I want to show another really resonant use case for me, which is pediatric emergency assessment. So we just looked at a use case for virtualizing experience-based training that oriented around frequency. A way to provide out immersive experience at a frequency, at a cadence necessary to prevent skills decay at scale. Well, with regard to pediatrics, there's some really other interesting aspects that sort of emerge with virtual reality, and that's what we can create physical findings. So here, fortunately, pediatric emergencies are rare, but that also means that we have very little experience in caring for infants and children with true critical emergencies. And the physical findings in little ones can be very subtle if you don't see them every day. Failing to interpret a physical finding or identify it can result in failure to act. So with pediatric, infant and toddler emergencies, you just can't rely on vitals. The challenge here is that many clinicians will need to rely on physical findings that they may never have seen before. And so how does that work? It results in failure to act. It results in misidentification. So another really cool aspect of virtual reality is the ability to create that which is not creatable. You can moulage a mannequin, I suppose, and try to recreate things. You can't recreate a 1,000-yard stare. So I want to show just a little bit of a video around this use case, which is leveraging virtual reality to demonstrate physical findings on a variety of infants and toddlers. And here, there's some interesting things that this app does relating to skin tone. So paleness can be very hard to identify in a light-skinned baby, while cyanosis can be challenging in a dark-skinned baby. Many of us have just never seen those things, period. And yet we'll have to make clinical decisions based on them. So how do we teach it?
The patient is 4 months old. His respiratory rate is 64.
All right, abnormal cry. We've got an abnormal gaze. I'm gonna say pallor. Also cyanosis.
In respiratory failure, you should position the head, open the airway, and suction or remove a foreign body as indicated. You would then initiate bag mask ventilation with 100% oxygen or establish an advanced airway as needed.
Okay, so that is just really cool because here we're able to train now and learn to recognize these physical findings so that we're ready for them when we encounter them. Let's shift to, I've got just a few more slides and then we're going to stop for some questions. Let's shift to another interesting use case that relates to both frequency, but also addresses implicit bias in healthcare. So this is actually our application. Health Scholars developed this in partnership with New York Health and Hospitals. And this is part of a maternal mortality reduction initiative across the city of New York. So maternal hemorrhage is the leading cause of maternal death. And studies really indicate that about a little over 60% of these deaths are preventable. Complicating this is that Black women are 4 times more likely to die from a obstetric hemorrhage than white women. And this type of training really requires immersion. It requires experiential learning to get it down. Yet mannequin-based training is just not sustainable at scale. So New York Health and Hospitals partnered with us to develop, to virtualize that mannequin-based training so that they could deploy the training across the organization with low-cost headsets. This is an Oculus Quest that I'm holding, and I guess a consumer Oculus Quest costs about $300. So in this example, by providing this frequent learning experience just over and over again, you're able to potentially, we hope, to mitigate implicit bias through procedural memory, which is like muscle memory. In developing this application, we had reached out and partnered with Anthony Greenwald. He's the Harvard professor who invented the implicit association test, the IAT test that assesses implicit bias, and felt that after all these years, I think it's like 50 years of research, he's identified that the single most important useful thing to move the needle is just rote procedural memory, surrounded by some contextual awareness of bias in of itself. Let's give just a couple other use cases. This is a surgical training use case. Here, my focus is very much on cognitive training. This one, VR is also leveraged for skills training. In this case, this is a VR unit that's combined with a haptic interface to practice orthopedic and spine surgeries. The benefits are that it enables like a safe environment to practice procedures over and over again. In this case, when it's not cognitive training and you really need like haptic devices, it then comes back to, it brings back the problems of scale. Like you can't really have 1,000 of these units just around your healthcare system, and they're certainly not portable. I think that we're really getting somewhere with glove technology, and likely in the future, especially as we integrate mixed reality, we'll start to see a lot less clunkiness in virtual reality as it pertains to surgical skills. Today, I really think it's ideally suited towards cognitive skills training. And this last use case, which I'm going to show, is probably the other domain that I'm really excited about, is VR now is being leveraged for empathy training. This is a VR application from the National Eye Institute, and they've simulated a number of different eye problems. So diabetic retinopathy, in this case, it's macular degeneration. And one puts on the headset and is able to sort of experience what it feels like to see the world with macular degeneration. And so this is called 360-degree VR. It's where one takes a special type of camera and films an environment and in 360 degrees and then puts it into VR. And here they've very accurately modeled what it feels like to have early macular degeneration. There's another super cool one around empathy that puts you into the shoes of an aging patient with dementia. Really, really powerful things here to promote empathy that we otherwise have not been able to do in the past. So just in summary, when do we use VR? Well, I think that the bottom line here is when there's a complex training is needed, or when you need to reach or you need to extend complex training out to a large learner population, that's when it's best to move training into virtualization, to virtualized training. With regard to small learner groups, even if it requires some synthesis, if it's very small, then we don't need to virtualize that. It's manageable. If there's just the task is just simple recall, probably not best suited for virtual reality. That's a great e-learning opportunity. But when you have large learner populations that need experience-based training, there's complex decision-making here. That's where we want to virtualize this and extend it out to the larger learner populations. So just some minimal requirements that I would recommend in terms of looking for VR learnings. That VR has a cool factor. So it's kind of flashy, it's really cool. But at the end of the day, we do need to learn something. So the experience in and of itself shouldn't interfere with the learning. We want a sufficient immersion such that a learner can suspend disbelief and really step into a clinical encounter. That means that there has to be a realistic design, there should be appropriate sounds and clinical accuracy. The user UX is user experience. The user experience is really important. In many apps will have handheld controllers, and that's how you kind of interact with the virtual environment. For me personally, it's been very important to me at our company, Health Scholars, to leverage our voice as much as possible. We don't walk around with these handheld controllers in the real world, and our voice is probably the most powerful tool that a clinician holds and uses every day. So why not use our voice in our clinical trainings? And more so, by virtue of using voice in clinical trainings, we now can assess the precision and adherence to best practices in communicating with our team members, and then identify where those gaps are and step back into training. It should be fun. It really should be measurable. So ideally, your VR is connected to a backend system so that you can, so there's reporting to the learner, but also an aggregate for the health system and to educators. There should be a scheduling capability, so it's not just kind of like crazy. You can't just throw VR across, into a health system and say, okay, here, go do something with this. So there needs to be some sanity around this in order to leverage all the benefits of VR. Just two more slides and then we'll do some questions. I very much am obviously a believer in simulation and in virtualizing this stuff so that we can reach large learner populations, but it's not the only modality. It's not it doesn't solve everything. So VR can replace, and it also can integrate into other modalities. It drops in very nicely into blended learning curriculums, where there perhaps is some e-learning for recall and to level up, and then step into a virtual environment for individualized deliberate practice and repeat that experience as many times as needed. And then at a much less frequent cadence, probably still makes sense to come around as a team around a mannequin and practice higher order team communication skills after everyone in that room has already achieved mastery of the medical aspects of the training. So my last slide here, the current ecosystem, or the ecosystem just before the advent of virtual reality, was kind of constrained to brick and mortar learning experiences with regard to experiential training. By virtualizing this type of experience, we now massively expand the capacity for experiential training. And we also can integrate multiple stakeholders into that training as well. We can bring in medical devices and pharma for learning how to practice with a new neurosurgical device. Maybe it's a spinal stimulator. we can send this breach the walls of the simulation center and provide that mannequin out to hundreds of thousands of learners multiple times, as often as needed to achieve mastery. So something I'm super excited about. I'm really, really, really grateful for having the opportunity to come back to SUNY Downstate and get to share this with everyone. I'd love to just pause here. We got looks like we have about 12 minutes for the hour, or 10 minutes for the hour. Love to take some questions. And just in full disclosure, I can't see the chat window, so I might need a little help.
No worries about that. Dr. Berger, I wonder if you wanted to say any words before we opened up?
Yeah, so first of all, Dr. Gillett, thank you for a really exciting and interesting talk. And when I love your example of the ACLS training, because I think most of us have gone through BLS and ACLS training, and you quickly realize that the experience really varies from session to session and trainer to trainer. And the learner doesn't always get the same experience. So I think the ability to standardize the training, cultivate expertise, and provide individualized feedback is really key across the platform. So one question I have is, how much is available currently in terms of VR commercially? Do you see the future as sort of having an app store for different virtual reality applications in medicine? How is this going to be incorporated into medical curricula?
That's a great question. So in the last 2 years, we've seen the ecosystem has seen an explosion of healthcare related, both patient care related and healthcare education related virtual reality companies, content producers. There is a significant volume of content at this point. With regard to choosing a provider to integrate into the curriculum, I think that it's best to look at this in the model in the same way that we look at a pharmacy. So when you walk into a pharmacy, you don't just see Merck products. And so there's a number of virtual reality companies that all do something a little bit different. So one of the ones that I showed was a surgical training. That's by there's a company called Fundamental VR and OSO VR. For surgical skills training, a number of applications to integrate into curriculum today from those companies. Health Scholars is heavily focused on cognitive training and those types of trainings that really require repeatability. Plenty of content there. I only showed just a smattering of our stuff because I didn't want to bias the presentation, but tons of content to integrate into the curriculum. In general, virtual reality is always going to be affordable and less expensive. And it's much like what we saw with billing software when we virtualized manual entry into software. There's a ton of billing softwares available for businesses. And because there's so many, the market drives down the cost. And now we're today in 2021, especially as we're approaching 2022, we're seeing a significant volume of content. I'd be more than happy afterwards to provide out some resources to a number of VR companies.
Thank you. I think Dr. Lucchese has a question. Chris, can we allow Dr. Lucchese? Dr. Lucchese, you're on mute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to say hi, Brian. It's just wonderful to see you. Thank you so much. You're a rock star, and keep going. You're just helping all the people that we care for.
Well, thank you, Lucchese. I have to get back to New York and see you in person, but this is just, so special for me to be here, at least virtually. And I'm glad that you're here to see that, about 2 decades later, I'm still at it after you got me with that simulator in that closet at Kings County.
Other questions? Patty Roblin. Single hospitals and stakeholder neighboring agencies could train together and have some unit cohesion on how to best handle a disaster situation. This would be a great and a coordinated response and will have more of a helpful regional impact. Have you done large scale regional disaster exercises?
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Patty. So emergency preparedness is a strong interest of mine, and Patty and I, with Dr. Aquila, work together on some of the largest emergency preparedness drills in New York City. So this is an area that is ripe for VR, and it couldn't be more appropriate for VR. And so 2 areas that we're focusing on right now that are very much sort of in research and development pertain to mass casualty incident training for the individual, and then the coordinated training on a multi-platform modality for coordination. So the individual all individuals need to be leveled up to the same proficiency, such that when they're coordinating together, the expectations are, and everyone has a shared mental model for what's supposed to happen, so that we can really focus on high order team communication. So a mass casualty incident for individual deliberate practice in VR could look like a start triage scenario where one is being presented with a number of injured and deceased victims walking well, and has to apply a triage protocol, one of the triage protocols to the mass casualty incident. Now, something that's really intriguing and interesting to us at Health Scholars is multiplayer disaster preparedness exercises. We were approached a few years ago by law enforcement, actually, that was interested in developing a combined response for an active shooter situation in the hospital. And that sort of blossomed into a lot of interesting conversations. But it started with, first, just a realization that there is a need to have a shared mental model of what each side of this response is doing. So clinicians need to know, and hospital staff need to know what's going to happen what is law enforcement going to do? What do I need to know about when they're entering the building in a mass shooter situation? And law enforcement needs to have the same understanding of what's going on with the clinical staff. That blossoms into a ton of interesting conversations around exercising and executing large-scale emergency preparedness drills in VR. So I didn't show any multiplayer applications. I'm, at the risk of disclosing my nerdiness, I do sometimes step into the Starship Enterprise and meet up with some friends and go off on adventures. So there are a number of VR vendors that do amazing multiplayer work, where one can join together any number of individuals, hundreds of folks together in the same virtual environment, and actually communicate with one another via the headset, practice and executing these large-scale regional emergencies. So it's a great question. There's not a lot out there right now. It's still an area of development, and I think that, and I know of, in addition to us, there's a handful of companies that are currently releasing these types of applications in 2022. A few European companies have done some really interesting things here.
So, Dr. Gillett, I want to thank you for your time. We're after the hour. If other people have questions for Dr. Gillett, send an email to Chris Worthy, and he'll have them forwarded to Dr. Gillett, and he'll respond directly to you. Again, I want to thank you for being the second speaker in our Digital Health Interest Group Seminar Series. And thank everyone who logged on and participated today. And we will be back next month. So thanks a lot, Dr. Gillett.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really been great.
Our honor. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gillett.
Thank you.